Harvey's wrath after days of catastrophic flooding.
All right, the epic monster storm prompting heroic rescues, and you're seeing some of them right now, by the thousands, and now blamed for, sadly, 18 deaths.
That number has gone up. The mandatory curfew in Houston just lifted after major concerns and reports of looting. We are live on the ground there with more on that in moments, but first.
Let's get straight to Janice Dean, who's tracking the latest path. Janice?
Another landfall you mentioned in Louisiana, Cameron, Louisiana, and we're still not out of the woods in terms of heavy rainfall for not only southeast Texas, but now Louisiana up towards the Mississippi River Valley. Houston, your days of drying out begin today. But there's the tornado threat. We actually had a tornado-warned storm west of New Orleans. We're watching this future radar. So still this area of low pressure, Tropical Storm Harvey, will remain stationary, and then it will start to move beginning in the next 12 to 18 hours, and it will be picked up by a cold front, a trough that will move this north and eastward over the weekend, but we still could see upwards of a foot of rainfall across the Mississippi River Valley as well as Louisiana. But look at Houston. This morning we are reporting no inches of rainfall, but still the river waters, the bayou waters are going to remain high. Major flood stage until at least next week. So any more rain in the forecast is not going to be a welcome sight. But for the foreseeable next 4 or 5 days, we're in the clear. But there's the latest track. As you mentioned, it made another landfall across Cameron, Louisiana. By tomorrow, it moves up towards the northeast. But look at this. We are in record-setting territory. Harvey, 51.88 inches. That was last night. The most rainfall we've ever seen from a tropical storm in Hawaii. I think we will beat that. Historic. Back to you.
Yeah, lower 48, it's got the record, sadly. It was just shy of 52 inches. Thanks so much. We should correct the deaths by a significant amount. It's not 18, it's actually 30.
30 people have died, including a police officer, and we will continue to report on that throughout the next 3 hours. But moments ago, an overnight mandatory curfew was lifted in Houston, where authorities are not only dealing with historic flooding, but armed robbers and looters.
And they're going to feel the wrath of the law. Griff Jenkins is in Houston with the latest. Griff.
Good morning, guys. That's right. The curfew just lifted. It was from midnight to 5 a.m. And as we've seen in these things, the best of humanity comes out. The countless hundreds of volunteers, the Cajun Navy, and others in rescues. But so, too, it brings out the worst in a few. 14 armed robbers arrested, according to the Houston police, and prosecutors here saying that they are now stiffening the penalty. If you burglarize a house normally, not during a major flood or disaster, it's 2 to 20 years. Now it's 5 to life with mandatory sentence time. This is Chief Art Acevedo weighing in with a message to the looters.
And here's what I like to say to people that would take advantage of individuals. This is the state of Texas, and we're a welcoming city, but we are not going to tolerate people victimizing, especially committing armed robberies of our community. We're going to catch you.
Now, we talked to a guy just trying to go to work today, and we're going to bring that to you in the next hour, what he had to say about how he feels about the looters. And finally, as Janice mentioned, the rain has stopped. Houston can dry out, but the flooding is going to continue where we are on the north side of these reservoirs. The Addicks Reservoir, the spillover point just a couple of miles up the road from me. Unfortunately, there's so much water in the system in these rivers coming down from the north that it is going to spill, according to the Harris County flood folks, for the next 4 to 5 weeks. This flooding is going to put homes underwater until October, guys, and the rescues are going to continue. It's going to be a very busy day as law enforcement has to now contend with both rescuing people and stopping these criminals that have unleashed the worst that humanity has to offer. Guys?
All right, thanks, Griff. Meanwhile, we're still in the rescue and escape phase, which is astounding because this is day 5.
Yeah.
I mean, this is day 5 because they were told to hunker down, and they didn't know how high it was going to get. They didn't know these dams were going to be topped. So therefore, there's going to be this improvised series of rescues is going to be needed even today.
Well,
very much so.
Griff was talking about the looters and the bad things that are happening. There's so many angels and so many heroes, however, that are responding to this call.
Yeah, you've got the worst of human nature, and then you've got the best of it. You see, I mean, really, if you watch this channel throughout the day yesterday, you saw images time and time again from our own reporters in the middle of it, but also watching helicopter rescues and human chains and just pure courage of people that don't know other people. There was no race or creed or background. There was just Americans and neighbors and citizens.
Look at this right
stepping
here.
up to
You
help
mentioned
each
the
other.
human chain. This is a lady who was in labor. Her husband, they called 911, couldn't get through, so they email everyone in their apartment complex saying, is anyone here an OBGYN or a nurse? Can you come help? An hour later, the fire department comes. They form this human chain to get her to the back of that truck to take her to the hospital. And the good news is the baby was born and all of them are doing well.
Right, and a lot of those people have not been trained in mom rescue. They're called, I'm going to make it happen. What about the fact that there are these shelters now, and a lot of people leave those shelters, and the dogs need to be rescued, so they come with the cages, and they get the dogs out with these flatboats, which I think are key in this area.
In such shallow water.
Yeah, such shallow
You know,
water.
Brian, your point, if it's on the 5th day of rescues and we're including pets, it's not to say that it isn't. I mean, obviously, we're reporting 18, now possibly 30 deaths. So this has been a tragedy. But you also see how organized it's really been. How many people have been able to the point where now animals are also being rescued.
See, what
too.
happened is people left their houses. Look at this man. This guy is Chance Ward and his son. They're both heroes. They posted this video on Facebook. They were rescuing horses that were trapped behind those metal gates. They were opening the gates and pulling the horses out so that they wouldn't die. But these stories are amazing. These heroes keep going back in and rescuing more and more people. We're hearing so many stories.
So I get this Shannon Bream gets this email yesterday during the radio show, and she says our husband and her friends keep going out, but they say the alligators and the snakes and the water is terrible, and so many times they're walking, they hit a manhole and they sink. So each time they're doing it, but they can't stop because these people are basically all alone waiting for somebody to come help them. Here is Jeff Flock yesterday, who does yeoman's work out in the field with this woman and her family right after she was rescued. Listen, look at this raw emotion.
You did not expect this was going to happen.
No, I didn't.
What's most upsetting to you right now?
The fact that I waited so long and my kids, I mean, I could put them in danger. I mean, thanks to them that showed up now because I didn't know who to call and I don't know if it was going to be too late and it was just an angel. I mean, yeah.
Who reached out to rescue them? A local church.
I know.
These civic organizations that are stepping up saying whatever assets we have, whatever leadership structure we have, our ability to communicate, we're going to use it to save lives.
Well, and as a parent, we all are parents. We can relate to that. You want to keep your kids safe. That's our job as parents. There was one toddler that was wading through the water. She was in a diaper and a T-shirt with a bottle.
We don't even know the
She got out of the
circumstances yet.
house, apparently, and a good Samaritan saw her and said, what are you doing out here? Where do you live? And she said, I'm just going on a walk. She had gotten out of the house. The little girl, thankfully, knew where she lived and was able to lead the Good Samaritan back to the house. Her dad opened the door and was astonished, had no idea that his daughter had escaped.
And Brian, you talk about day 5. This is also day 5 of heroes, of police officers, of firefighters.
Sleeping in the police station.
Sleeping in police stations. We saw National Guardsmen sleeping in furniture stores on mattresses because these businesses
The
opened
mattress
up.
store opened up.
The mattress store opened up for them. And unfortunately, one life lost yesterday was a Houston police officer.
Right. Here, in fact, is the sergeant talking about Art Acevedo. This is Art Acevedo, I should say, the Houston Police Chief, talking about the death of Steve Perez.
We couldn't find him, and once our dive team got there, it was too treacherous to go under and look for him. So we made a decision to leave officers there waiting until the morning, because as much as we wanted to recover him last night, we could not put more officers at risk for what we knew in our hearts was going to be a recovery mission. I had the privilege of notifying his wife and his son and his extended family at their home that he died, and he laid down his life. But I'm heartened by 2 things. Number 1, I got to learn that it's a family of faith, that has faith in God, and when you have faith, there's hope. The wife told me she had asked him not to go in. He told him not to go because the conditions were so bad. And his response was, we've got work to do.
Wow. So there you go.
34 years on the force.
And those cops are also working overtime, and more are flooding in from outside. And there's also a call from from the outside for 20,000 more National Guardsmen who have yet to be implemented. Meanwhile, the president, as we mentioned yesterday during our show, went on Air Force One to Corpus Christi en route to Austin to see as close as he can for himself what's going on.
Yeah, he went to Corpus Christi, and did you see the image? This is the president and the first lady getting off of Air Force One. They landed in Corpus Christi first, and then they went to Austin. When they were in Corpus Christi, he stood on the bumper of a fire truck, and he waved the Texas flag. It was beautiful, and he just talked about the resilience of Texas and surveyed the damage and was there to just rally all the communities. There he is with the Texas flag.
You know, I'm reading Glenn Thrush today, one of his biggest critics, mocked on SNL, and he says that the word from inside the White House is the president is more involved with this than almost anything, including the election, because he wants to know every detail of what's happening to stay ahead of it. I actually think that he is at his best when under pressure, and man, is he under pressure.
Absolutely, and this is what he had to say yesterday before holding up that flag. Take a listen.
This has been a total cooperative effort. Again, we will see you soon. I will tell you, this is historic. It's epic what happened. But you know what? It happened in Texas, and Texas can handle anything. Thank you all, folks. Thank you.
I love that he wore the USA hat instead of the Make America Great Again. Many people love those hats, but including the president. But the USA, we're all united. We're one country right now.
That's been his message for a long time, is we're not black, we're not white, we're not left, we're not right. We're Americans. And when you're able to show it, crisis reveals leadership. In this moment, you've got people underwater wondering where their lives are going. Mm-hmm. And he tried a delicate balance of being there but not being too close so you're not interfering with the rescue efforts. But at the same time showing Washington cares, the federal government's going to be here. We want boots on the ground to assess. And I've heard the same thing, Brian. He's as involved in this as anything in his presidency to make sure they get it right.
Right. And so far, the FEMA director has been phenomenal. Meanwhile, it didn't stop his critics from blasting his wife, who, Melania Trump, the first lady, who wore FLOTUS hat for the first time I've seen, when she left the White House, she had high heels on. And that seemed to be the headline on almost every blog.
You know, I mean, this is ridiculous. Really, like you said, Pete, lives are at stake here. Why are we worried about fashion right now? Why aren't we worried about the lives that are there? She changed into tennis shoes when she got to Texas.
Look at the headlines.
Melania's stilettos slideshow. Look at this one. Melania Trump wears her stilettos to tour Houston flood zone. No joke.
Yeah.
So here's the first lady, insisted on being there, been lauded for her compassion when she travels overseas, wanted to be there herself, ended up going when she was on the scene in sneakers, but was ripped for wearing high heels en route to Air Force One.
If you're the first lady, you can't be fashionable. And let us know what you think. Friends at FoxNews.com. Is it inappropriate for her to be traveling with the President of the United States as he assesses a disaster zone?
Well, you know what? Hillary Clinton tweeted something. She said something to the effect of, if you criticize one woman, then you're criticizing all women. You can't criticize someone for their clothes, for their wardrobe choices. Especially, she's in Washington, D.C. when she's wearing that. Then she goes to the hurricane area and she changes into tennis shoes. Can we just focus on being Americans for one day, please?
10 seconds, yeah. It's true. Well said. Well, Joel Osteen, who's faced a lot of criticism, he's now opening his church doors to thousands of flood victims in Houston, but not fast enough for his critics. His side of the story. He joins us live this morning.
Amazing channel.
Fox News alert, historic rainfall and flooding from Harvey, putting two main reservoirs on the brink in the Houston area. Joining us right now is Colonel Paul Owen. He's the Southwestern Division Commander of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Colonel, I can imagine you're really worried about a lot of things. What's the number one thing that's on your mind right now that we should be aware of?
Well, the first thing that I'd like to say is, man, it's pretty amazing what the first responders are doing in this area, and we feel a kinship with soldiers with first responders, so really amazed what those guys are doing. So our biggest area of emphasis right now is the reservoirs at Addicks and Barker, and particularly the Addicks Reservoir. So the dam height is about 108 feet. The water is about 109 feet, so we're seeing some of the water go around the end of the dams, and so we're monitoring that very closely. But I think I'd just like to reassure people that the dam, as it was planned, is operating as expected, but we're monitoring it closely. There's a very, very low probability of any kind of catastrophic failure at this point, but we certainly are watching those structures very closely.
the non-professional like myself would think the rain has stopped and maybe we could worry about what happens as the water goes down. Should we be thinking like that?
We're going to watch that closely. You know, we're releasing controlled water also from the reservoirs in a way that's going to take, you know, on the order of weeks to relieve some of the pressure from the homes that are affected by this, that are upstream of that reservoir. So we're going to continue to do that. You know, we're also worried about the navigation channels that are and the ports of Houston that have been impacted by this storm. So we have a lot of efforts going out to survey and ensure that there are no obstructions to navigation to get those ports back open again with the assistance of the Coast Guard.
When do you think the water will begin to noticeably go down? Could we see that today?
Well, we think the water is still rising. You know, even though it stopped raining, there's still a lot of water collecting in the basins that still have to come to, specifically the Addicks and Barker Reservoir. But we only expect it to rise to maybe 111 feet at the most. So it's at 109 right now. We won't see it go that much higher. And we don't expect to see any really dramatic flows around the ends of the dams at this point.
How many people on your teams, and what are you asking them to do today?
Yeah, so we have, you know, there's about 400 people in the Galveston district of the Army Corps of Engineers that they're heroic people that have had their families and homes impacted by this storm, and you know they're putting their rucksack on and they're going to work and they're trying to help by monitoring this dam and trying to prevent as much further damage as we can by operating those projects. So thanks for asking about those guys. They're doing an incredible job down there for us.
Right, and they got to get their rest because this is going to be weeks. It's going to be months. We're going to need the expertise. And we need you too, Colonel. Thanks so much for joining us, Colonel Paul Owen.
Thank you.
All right, straight ahead. And it's a Fox News alert. The U.S. firing back overnight after North Korea's latest missile tests over Japan. So what happens? Could Guam be next? Daniel Hoffman is a former CIA station chief. He's here to react to this unprecedented launch. Plus, a college professor suggests Texans deserve all this devastation because they voted for President Trump, but karma just caught up with him. We'll tell you why one professor is...
Good Wednesday morning, back with some quick headlines. Democrats finally condemning Antifa protesters after chaos at a weekend rally in Berkeley. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi says democracy has no room for inciting violence. Berkeley's mayor now calling on UC Berkeley to cancel a conservative free speech rally next month. This after violent clashes erupted in February over an appearance by Milo Yiannopoulos.
If there was a far-left speaker that was coming to Berkeley campus who we knew would draw extremist groups to clash, I would express the same concerns. It has nothing to do with the content of speech.
The school says they have no plans to cancel the event. An American man is behind bars, busted trying to join ISIS in Syria. 22-year-old Parvez Ahmed detained in the Middle East and sent back home to New York City. He's facing up to 20 years behind bars. Ahmed has been on the government's radar for years after making terroristic posts on social media. He once told federal agents he wrote them when he was high on marijuana. Pete.
That's news. Thanks, Jenny. Well, a Fox News alert. While you were sleeping, the U.S. firing back, successfully launching its own missile test off the coast of Hawaii. This in response to brand new threats from North Korea. The rogue regime now threatening to strike Guam, claiming recent missiles over Japan were just the first step. So what are the president's critical next steps? Here to weigh in, former CIA station chief and vice president of SPG, Daniel Hoffman. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I'll go right to that initial question. What are our next steps in light of this provocative move from Kim Jong-un?
I think the first thing is we've made it very clear to North Korea that an attack on Guam or any of our territories would result in the regime's destruction. And it starts there with deterrence, a credible deterrence, and I think we've made that very, very clear to the regime.
Okay, so, but it feels like the same tit for tat. We've said we want to end strategic patience, but it feels like, hey, don't do that. Okay, you did it. Hey, don't do that. How do you prevent this cycle where they continue to test and then eventually get to their ultimate goal, which is a nuclear weapon capable of striking our homeland?
That's right. That is the ultimate goal, that nuclear weapon capable of striking the homeland. It's the ultimate deterrent for Kim Jong-un. He feels like he needs it. He knows forefront, I think, in his mind was the fate of other dictators like Saddam and Gaddafi who lacked the weapons of mass destruction, which would have enabled their regime's security. So we know not a lot has worked. Diplomacy hasn't worked. Sanctions haven't been enforced effectively. I think we need to try to continue along those lines. I do think we need to add a measure of cyber to sanctions because North Korea has mounted offensive cyber operations to steal money to pay for their nuclear weapons program. And I think we need to mount defensive counter-cyber operations against them.
We hear increasingly strong rhetoric, including more recently from the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, saying this just will not be tolerated. Is there a point at which we shoot down one of these? We had a successful test, as we mentioned at the beginning of this segment, of shooting down a medium-range missile, which this was from North Korea. Do we shoot one down at some point?
Yeah, I would expect that the intelligence community and the U.S. military is working very closely together on that challenge. And I think shooting down a weapon with missile defense is certainly an option. It's part of deterrence, part of making it clear that we won't stand for these additional tests.
What would it mean geopolitically if that ability, and then potentially shared it with even their friends like Iran?
That they'll have a nuclear weapon capable of striking the homeland. Secondly, that they could proliferate that technology to not just rogue regimes, but non-state actors as well. And then in the event of war in the Korean Peninsula, you might be faced with a loose nuke scenario. So this is a real challenge for the intelligence community and for our U.S. military and policymakers.
But we hear time and time again that we're getting closer and closer and closer. Does that mean we're getting closer to military action because those other alternatives have not worked yet?
I think we need to consider all options. I do believe that whether it's a covert action or military action to try to break the regime's hold on its population or its nuclear weapons is a very risky endeavor, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider that, as the president has said, all options on the table.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem that time makes those options any better either. If we had struck 10 years ago, our scenario would be better than if we did today. So time only makes it worse for us, it feels like.
Yes.
It does. Well, Daniel Hoffman, thanks for your service to our country and for your expertise. We appreciate it. All right, well, is violence like this ever okay? Yep, that's Antifa in their helmets with their shields and their clubs. One liberal college professor thinks so, and now his faculty has his back, saying conservatives are the ones giving Antifa a bad rap. Plus, Texans waking up to more devastation. We're live on the ground with an update on the historic flooding next. Don't go anywhere.
I waited so long, and my kids, I could have put them in danger. Thanks to them that showed up now, because I didn't know who to call, and I don't know if it was going to be too late, and it was just an angel.
Builds value.
Texans helping Texans, and I would really say the story has evolved to Americans helping Texans.
You know, we're back with the Fox News Alert, and we're seeing these catastrophic scenes out of Houston. The death toll from Harvey rises this morning to at least 18. Some have it at 30.
Traffic lights nearly submerged at intersections, flooded with nearly 20 feet of water.
Those are the tops of trees.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. Our own Rob Schmidt live in Sugar Land, Texas with the latest. Rob, good morning.
Good morning, guys. Yeah, this is the only one that we've found like this, but it certainly is an illustration of the amount of water that's come in here. It's actually incredible to see. They're pumping it out right now, so it's going down really fast. This is a very critical intersection here on the west side of Houston. This is the 90 and the 99. If you're from around here, you know that this is a big intersection. It dips down here into kind of a bowl, and it's just collected all this water. You can see the traffic lights next to me. Let's put up the double screen here to show you what it looks like during the daytime and what it looked like yesterday when we got here before they started pumping it out. You could have swam right out there and grabbed that red light, pulled yourself on it, and sat on top of it. And if I was a little younger, I probably would have tried to do that, although it's not the smartest thing to do. One kid did take a swim out there. He swam all the way across the intersection. You can see the video there. We don't advise anything like that, but it's just crazy to see this thing turn into basically a lake here underneath this freeway. As far as the rescue effort goes, it continues, and it has really it's increased dramatically. We've had over 13,000 rescues. There's been that many people that needed to be saved from their situation. That is incredible when you think about it. We've got about that same number of people that are in shelters right now. We have one gentleman we talked to in Katy, which is just a little bit north of here, which was just decimated by flooding. There's a reservoir and a levee right near there. He says that they had to come out of the house, and they had 5 feet of water on the first floor of their house. Let's listen to him.
We had a ladder, they didn't have one, so we had a ladder to get up on the boat, so they were able to get us out.
But you probably had to swim out of your house, essentially.
Pretty much.
So it's just incredible to hear that. You having to swim out the front door of your house. Imagine what that would be like. He also showed us some incredible helicopter footage of his next door neighbor being rescued via helicopter. They pulled his neighbor off of the roof of his own house, and he sat there and shot it with his phone from his house. Can you imagine seeing something like that? So it's countless stories like this, and this is going to continue. We've got this weather is improving finally. We've got dry weather. The stars are out right now. The sun's going to be out today. That's going to help. But some areas are going to continue to get flooding coming in. We're going to have rainwater from other places still dumping in as the reservoirs are still overflowing. The rivers continue to rise. So some places will actually get wetter while the rest of this area, southeast Texas, the Houston area, does continue to dry out. So it really depends on where you are. If you're near the Brazos River, things could get worse today. And that's basically the situation. That's what it's going to be like for a while. As we said, this is over 50 inches of rain. It's unprecedented to see this much water. Guys, we'll send it back to you.
All right. Thanks, Rob. And I've been to Sugar Land a couple of times. It's one of these areas you think it's so clean and new. It looks like they shrink wrap it at night. I mean, the fact is there's a lot of, it's a very affluent area in particular, very prideful area, very patriotic area. And I know they're going to be looking to get right back in. As soon as they saw that water down behind Rob, you know there's going to be a massive push to get to see what's left of their belongings.
Houston is the fourth largest city in the country. So you've got these neighborhoods, these suburbs, like you have Sugar Land and you have the Woodlands, to name a few. But yeah, they are some these beautiful homes. I've actually been to Sugar Land too.
And Houston is as broad, it's as wide of a metro area as we have in this country. So when it's described right now, it's almost the sixth Great Lake is how it was described yesterday by the Red Cross. I mean, that gives you a sense of the scope of how wide it is.
All right. Well, Tropical Storm Harvey, it did make a second landfall overnight just across the Texas border in Louisiana, in Cameron, Louisiana, slamming the Gulf state with even more heavy rain.
All right. So while we look at Houston and not the aftermath yet, but the challenge is then we got to focus on Louisiana. They're about to get smacked. Hey, Janice.
We have flooding emergencies right now east of Houston, Beaumont, as well as Port Arthur. So if you reflect back to Hurricane Katrina, I know a lot of people, we were all focused on New Orleans. We're all focused on Houston right now, but we have flooding emergencies, people that cannot get rescued right now east of the Houston area in Beaumont and Port Arthur, flooding emergencies right now. So we're going to be watching you throughout the hours because you can see the radar. The radar has moved a little bit east of Houston, but we're still seeing incredible rainfall rates for southeast Texas in towards Louisiana, and the storm made a second landfall. It is still a tropical storm. I also want to touch on the Buffalo Bayou because even though we're expecting drier weather over the next 5 days, we're going to still see the Buffalo Bayou at West Belt Drive, for example, at 70 feet. That's major record flood stage for days, if not weeks. So any rain in the forecast is not welcome news. And again, we're focused on Houston, but we are watching you all over Texas, southeast Texas, and Louisiana. We're watching the future radar as we get in through today. Finally, Thursday, we'll get a trough, a cold front that picks this thing up north and eastward, but still dealing with the potential for flooding, not only for southeast Texas, Louisiana, even into Mississippi, across the Florida Panhandle, and then up towards the Mississippi River Valley. There's the official track making another landfall in Cameron, Louisiana. And I mentioned drier skies. We saw, Rob, drier skies, but we're still going to see those bayou levels at or capacity for the next several weeks. And if I could, I just want to point out that this now is the wettest Texas tropical system. If we reach past 52 inches, that will make it of all time in U.S. history. One more thing. We are into tropical season. We are watching this off the coast of Africa. Why? Because as we get into the weekend and next week, this will be a major hurricane, perhaps looking at landfall across the East Coast. Back to you.
Gosh.
Thanks, Janice.
Yep. And Harvey won't die. He's just staying there. And then he's going to move up the east.
They say it will be the most expensive storm in the history of the United States.
And we're speaking with the governor of Louisiana in this show. Meanwhile, 22 minutes before the top of the hour, Jillian, you have other breaking news.
Yes, I do. Good morning. Good Wednesday morning to you at home. Let's begin with this story. Televangelist Joel Osteen speaking out after being accused of refusing to help flood victims. Critics claim he was lying about water inside his mega church. The church posting these photos of the flooding as Osteen denies turning people away and says he doesn't pay attention to critics.
You know, you can't necessarily open your building when it's, when it's very close to flooding itself. But we were blessed to not have flooding here, but we're also very precautious about, before we put a bunch of people in here, let's make sure everything is safe.
Hundreds of people now taking shelter inside the church. You'll get to hear more from Osteen himself when he joins us live in the 8 o'clock as Stirs to Get Tired, walking from Charlottesville to Washington. The march to confront white supremacy started with 200 people on Monday. The turnout quickly dwindling to just 35 marchers by yesterday morning. Organizers blaming rain for the poor attendance. Talk about instant karma. The professor who said Texas deserved Hurricane Harvey after voting for President Trump, he just got fired. Ken Story tweeted this, quote, "I don't believe in instant karma, but this kind of feels like it for Texas. Hopefully this will help them realize the GOP doesn't care about them," end quote. The post was deleted. The damage, though, was already done. The University of Tampa saying, quote, "We condemn the comments and the sentiment behind them." The Confederate cleanse continues, this time at a high school bearing the name of one of the most famous Civil War generals. A San Antonio school district unanimously voting to rename Robert E. Lee High School following the deadly riots in Charlottesville. While more than 3,500 people signed a petition to have it removed, nearly 6,000 other signatures were collected asking it to stay. Those are your headlines on this Wednesday. Send it back.
So the ones who want him to stay outnumber the ones who want him to... Okay.
Yep.
But it's gone. All right. Thanks, Jillian. All right, 20 minutes now before the top of the hour.
A warning for Republicans from the White House, from the House Freedom Caucus chairman. Listen.
12 legislative days in September will decide whether we're going to remain in power as a Republican majority or not.
Senator Mike Lee is one of those Republicans working on the Hill, and he's here live to talk about the mission for those 12 days in September.
Plus, more on the flooding crisis in Texas. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price, Joel Osteen, David Bossie, and Senator Ted Cruz. An amazing lineup, and they all join us live on the show.
Hey, Senator.
Senator, how you doing?
Right now.
We have some quick headlines for you. Defense Secretary Mattis halting the transgender military ban, at least for now. This as the Pentagon conducts a study on how to best carry out the president's directive by looking at how transgender soldiers impact military readiness and budgets. And the city of Denver taking steps to protect illegals. City council members unanimously passing a new measure banning officials from asking an arrested person about their immigration status. The city will also ignore ICE detainer requests and ban immigration officials from conducting in-person jail interviews without a warrant.
Next, the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus laying out an aggressive plan to tackle everything from the debt ceiling to tax reform when Congress is back in session next month. Take a listen.
We're going to have to juggle them, and if we don't, I can tell you that really the next 12 days, and that's all we have, 12 legislative days in September, will decide whether we're going to remain in power as a Republican majority or not.
Joining us now with more on this to get his perspective on the GOP plan, the member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and author of Written Out of History. It's a great book, Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee. Senator, you're working with the Freedom Caucus, I understand, on what do you plan on doing in 12 days? Is it possible to get this done?
Sure, it's impossible to get all kinds of things done. Look, the fact is, Republican majorities were elected in the House and in the Senate. Now, we've now got a Republican president. We've got every opportunity to reform the way we spend money in Washington, to make sure that we don't wait until 48 hours before the expiration of a spending period and then just plop a piece of legislation on the floor and say, okay, it's past that or past nothing. We need to start debating and discussing things and giving opportunities for each individual member of Congress to make improvements to a spending bill.
Why do
to
you
reduce
say?
spending.
Why do you say the 12 days in September? It's make or break for Republicans because you'll still be there in October and November.
Sure. This is when the spending period expires, and this is when we decide how much we're going to spend in the next fiscal year, which begins the very next day. So when we decide that we're not going to make any changes to spending, that sends a loud signal, especially since we now have a united Republican government. We need to govern differently. We need to show that we're going to prioritize spending differently than we did under a Democratic
So that pass a budget, raise the debt ceiling, as well as get onto tax reform.
Yes. Tax reform is also very important. It's something Republicans have campaigned on for at least the last 7 or 8 years, and we've got to get on to that next. I think that will be the next thing to come up after debt ceiling and after spending.
But, Senator, we haven't seen any of this happen yet. Republicans have had these levers of control since Inauguration Day, and none of this has happened. Why will this change?
Well, one of the things that happens is that when we're up against a deadline, it tends to accelerate things. Now, I was one of the members calling for us not to take any recess at all in August until such time as we got health care reform and tax reform done. That nonetheless happened, to my great disappointment, but there's still time. There's still time for us to get something done. We have to actually do it.
I want you to comment on Brent Bozell. He's the chairman for America Breitbart article. He wrote this article, and it says, come the congressional elections next year, the presidential election in 2020, the grand old party will once again bellow its hallowed promises. But this time it won't work. This time there will be no straw men to blame. This time their voters will know those hallowed promises are not even hallowed promises. They are lies.
Brent Bozell makes some very fair points there. And look, there is no question about the fact that we can only cry wolf so many times. We can only say so many times, we will govern differently if given a chance. We have to actually do it now. Now, it's difficult. There's no question about it. But we have to do those difficult things. We have to govern differently and show that we as Republicans believe in stronger citizens. And that's one of the reasons why we promote the cause of constitutionally limited government, because it makes for stronger citizens and more heroic communities.
So as we debate the history of this country and try to rewrite it and all sanitize it or change it because we got it down in this century, you write the book Written Out of History, and this is really so apropos because they're trying to whitewash what made America America.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's one of the reasons why I focus in this book on these individual heroes who have been forgotten or neglected, written out of history. People like Mum Bet. Mum Bet was a slave in Massachusetts at the time of the Revolution. She fought for and won her freedom in court after reading a provision or learning of a provision in the newly adopted Massachusetts state constitution. She didn't have to wait for a government program to do that. She sought out her own position in court and fought for it and won it. She's a true hero, but we forget about her because she doesn't match our narrative of what the founding fathers and founding mothers looked like.
It is a fantastic book, but I believe congressional Republicans will be written out of history if they can't get anything done before.
That is a fair point, and we don't want congressional Republicans to be written out of history. We've got a unique moment right now. I remember the day President Trump was sworn into office. He said, I want this to represent not just a transfer of power from one presidency to another, one party to another. This is a transfer of power from Washington, D.C. back to the American people. We have this opportunity, but we've got to seize it. Right. We've got to govern differently. We've got to spend less. We've got to return power and influence back to the states where it belongs.
I think some Republicans just aren't over the fact that a Republican president won and it wasn't the one they wanted, and they have to get over it.
Well, certainly any personal differences can't come into play here. We've got to set those aside, and we've got to identify what it is that our Constitution already requires and that our history has taught us works for the American
And let the history show that Mike Lee is somebody who was working to get things together so you can hit the ground running when you go back to Washington. Thanks,
Thank you. Thanks for coming on.
Straight ahead, is violence like this ever okay? One liberal college professor thinks so. And now his faculty has his back, saying conservatives are the ones bringing Antifa a bad rap.
Plus, coming up, a governor who knows what it's like picking up the pieces after a hurricane, what Chris Christie learned from Sandy when he joins us live in moments.
A Dartmouth professor condemned by his employer for these comments defending Antifa violence.
When pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence. The way that neo-Nazism grows is by becoming legitimate. The way to stop that is what people did in Boston, what people did in Charlottesville.
Now, his Dartmouth faculty penning a letter supporting their colleague, writing, quote, Professor Bray has been disavowed by Dartmouth at the request of a right-wing organization, Campus Reform, whose goal is to smash left-wing scum and which offers bounty prizes to students who will turn in professors' names for a campaign of harassment. Well, here to respond is Campus Reform editor-in-chief and Dartmouth alumni, Sterling Beard. Hey, Sterling, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You're welcome. So this guy, this professor at Dartmouth, goes on and he says, his quote on Meet the Press is, Antifa's use of violence is a legitimate response. The president of Dartmouth comes out and says supporting violent protests does not represent the views of Dartmouth. So many people were applauding the president for coming out and saying that we don't support violence. But then you have these 17 professors who want the president to retract those comments, and they want him now to apologize. So as a graduate of Dartmouth, what do you think of this?
Well, as a graduate of Dartmouth, I was actually rather proud of President Phil Hanlon. I think that he was quite right to say that, this is not something Dartmouth supports. I wish more college professors would come out and say this sort of violence on our campuses from Antifa, from this sort of support of political violence is never acceptable. More college presidents need to come out and say this, because Antifa is a terroristic organization. That's why we've seen over 300,000 people sign a White House petition demanding it be labeled as such. You can see just from the video that you're showing right now how violent Antifa actually is.
Yeah, so by saying that, is he supporting the violence? Is he saying it's okay to be violent, and those 17 professors that are standing behind him?
Look, when you turn around and say that political violence in the United States is legitimate, any kind of political violence in the United States is legitimate, that's a terrible, horrible thing to say, all right? That's not how we settle things in the United States. We settle them at the ballot box. We settle them civilly. We settle them through debate. I understand Dartmouth's faculty circling the wagons around another professor. I get that, but they are, in fact, in the wrong.
All right, what did you make of what he said about campus reform? Intentionally and predictably